Welcome back. President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, as we said, is in an African tour for 3 countries, Angola, Zambia, and Mozambique. And to shed more light on this, we have the pleasure to have this phone with Ambassador Hussein Hareidy, former Assistant Foreign Minister. Good morning, Your Excellency.
Good morning, my lady.
Ambassador Hareidy, the President is in an African tour to Angola, Zambia, and Mozambique. And during the visit, the President attends and participates in the COMESA meetings, as Egypt is going to hand over the presidency to Zambia. So a very busy schedule for the President that started with Angola. So give us an idea about the importance of the activities by the President for this African tour. And let's start first with Angola, as the President met with the Angolan President and they held a press conference during which both leaders agreed on cooperation between Egypt and Angola.
Well, I believe that this tour of President al-Sisi to 3 countries in the southern part of Africa comes in the context of a policy that President al-Sisi has set up during his term in office, in which he visited all the main geographic zones in Africa. The last time President al-Sisi had visited the Ivory Coast and Guinea. So this is in the western part of Africa. Previously, President al-Sisi paid various visits to countries in the eastern part of Africa. And he was the first Egyptian president to visit Djibouti in the Horn of Africa in 2021. So the present tour comes in the context of this policy by President al-Sisi to visit most African countries with, of course, an objective, a strategic objective of strengthening and promoting bilateral relations between Egypt and African countries on the one hand, and to move forward, and the other hand, to move forward the African agenda in the international scene.
Yes, Your Excellency, Ambassador Hareidy, actually to speak in the same context as you've just mentioned, we can see that President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi is really keen on boosting relations between Egypt and the African countries, and that was very clear when the President was the President of the African Union. And he is boosting relations between Egypt and the African countries, which were, and these relations were neglected years ago before President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi came to office. But since the President came to office, he was very keen on boosting relations between Egypt and the African countries. And actually, analysts and papers and journalists not only in Egypt but all over the world describe the scene as that Egypt is back to Africa and Africa is back to Egypt. What's your comment?
Well, as an Egyptian diplomat, of course, I can't subscribe to the point of view of journalists and analysts, because Egypt, first of all, is an African power, is an African country. Yes, there were some times that the priorities of Egyptian foreign policy were different. Like, for instance, the period from 1970, after the October War, till 1979. At the time, the priority, the strategic priority of the Egyptian foreign policy was to how to build on the victory in the October War and achieve a certain peace with the Hebrew state. But having said that, let's not forget, and despite this fact, in March 1977, and I make a point of referring to this. In March 1977, the former and late President Anwar Sadat hosted in Egypt the first African Arab Summit. And so this is just one example of the continuity of Egyptian foreign policy concerning the African dimension in Egyptian diplomacy. In the last 10 years, what happened in the last 10 years, personally speaking, was that the tempo of the visits of President Sisi to African countries, the tempo was quicker than maybe in previous periods. But the fact remains that Africa, the second, by the way, the second major and most important circle in Egyptian diplomacy is the African circle. So of course, I agree with you that during the last 7 years, Egyptian diplomacy has paid a lot of attention to our African connections.
Yes.
And this has been, of course, manifested in the fact that President Sisi was the first Egyptian president, or let me put it historically, the first Egyptian head of state. Because when I use the head of state here, I'm referring to the pre-1952 period and the post-1952 period. He was the first Egyptian head of state to pay a visit to the Ivory Coast, to Djibouti in 2021. So, of course, I agree with you, Madam, that during the last 7 years, of course, Egyptian diplomacy in Africa has been very active.
Yes. Your Excellency, Ambassador Hareidy, what are the means of cooperation that could result from President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi's African tour this time?
Well, it's three things.
Yes.
Three axes. The bilateral one, that is to say, Egyptian-Angolan relations, Egyptian-Zambian relations, Egyptian relations with Mozambique. This is the first axis. The second axis would be discussing exchange of views of African challenges. Let's just, as one example, the foreign debts of some African countries, because this is one of the very serious problems facing Africa. The other topic is, of course, fighting terrorism. You have, in this context, we have the situation in Al-Sahel, in sub-Saharan Africa. You have the situation in Sudan, in Somalia, even in Mozambique. Yes. The Daesh organization, or the so-called Islamic State organization, Islamic State here, between commas, this terrorist organization has carried out terrorist attacks in Mozambique. So the third axis would be the how to cooperate, how to promote cooperation among African countries in order to have a say in the international agenda. Africa, for instance, just to give you one example, Africa is not represented in the G20. Africa has no permanent seat in the Security Council.
Yes.
And I remember that during the American summit with the African leaders last December, President Biden promised that the United States or his administration would work towards enabling Africa of having a permanent seat in the Security Council. So these are the ideas that President Sisi would probably discuss with his host.
I thank you. Yes, I thank you very much for your time. Thank you for your valuable information, Your Excellency Ambassador Hussein Hareidy, former Assistant Foreign Minister. Thank you very much for joining us over the phone. I really had the honor to have this phone with you. Well, with this, my dear viewers, we come to the end of this episode of our program, The Breakfast Show. My name is Amal Mukhtar. Thank you for watching.